The quiet hum of the small suburban neighborhood was shattered by the crackling roar of flames. Sparks danced like fireflies in the night sky, lighting up the faces of a group of men standing in the shadows. They wore masks, but their hateful sneers needed no translation. The fire they had started was meant to destroy, to send a message of fear and control, but they had no idea who they had targeted. Inside the charred remains of the house, barely standing amidst the smoke, was not just a victim. This wasn't a frightened woman beaten down by hatred and bigotry. This was Captain Nyla Shadow Hayes, a decorated Army Ranger, a woman who had served her country in ways these men could never imagine. She had survived the harshest terrains, infiltrated enemy strongholds, and stared death in the face more times than she cared to count. Tonight, however, the battlefield had come to her doorstep. Earlier that evening, Nyla had been returning home from her shift at a local community center. It was her way of giving back, helping the kids in her neighborhood see that their dreams were bigger than their circumstances. She had felt the weight of tiredness in her bones, but it was the good kind, earned through hard work and purpose. Her modest house, nestled at the end of a quiet street, had always been her sanctuary. She could never have predicted the sight that awaited her when she turned the corner. Her home was ablaze, the flames clawing at the night sky as neighbors gathered helplessly at a distance. Nyla didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the inferno, ignoring the cries to stop. Every muscle in her body responded like it had in combat, instincts honed over years of training kicking in. If someone was inside, she had to get them out. The smoke was suffocating as she burst through the front door, her mind racing as she scanned the rooms. Thankfully, she had been alone that night, no family or friends to worry about, but what she found instead made her stomach churn. The living room walls were spray-painted with hateful words, the symbols of ignorance and malice scrawled in dripping red paint. This wasn't just an act of violence. It was personal. Someone had targeted her, hoping to silence her, to make her disappear. As firefighters arrived to battle the blaze, Nyla stood on the curb, her face a mask of calm, though her mind was a storm of emotions. She overheard the whispers of neighbors, the speculation, the shock. Who could have done this? Why? But Nyla knew better than to ask those questions. She didn't need to know why. She needed to know who. And she needed to make sure they never did this to anyone else. What the perpetrators hadn't counted on was that their victim wouldn't crumble. They didn't know that Nyla Hayes wasn't just any woman. She had spent years operating in the shadows, a ghost who struck fear into the hearts of the world's most dangerous adversaries. And now she had a new mission, one that wasn't sanctioned by the military but burned just as fiercely in her soul. The flames had consumed her house, but not her resolve. Nyla stood among the ashes, a figure of unshakable strength. Somewhere in the crowd she caught a glimpse of a man lingering too long, his gaze too sharp, his demeanor too stiff. A shiver of recognition passed through her. Was he one of them? Or was her battle-hardened mind reading into shadows that weren't there? She didn't have the answers yet, but she would find them. As the night gave way to dawn, Nyla began to piece together her plan. The fire was only the beginning. For them and for her. She would not just rebuild her home. She would hunt down the cowards who tried to destroy her life. They thought they could erase her with fire, but they had only awakened a force they couldn't comprehend. And so, with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, Nyla Hayes set out to remind the world, and her enemies, why she was called Shadow. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a battle for every person who had ever been underestimated, attacked, or silenced. But how far would she have to go to bring them to justice? At what cost? The answers lay ahead, but for now the embers of her burning house were only the prelude to a much larger inferno. Nyla spent the next few hours pacing through the remains of her home, her boots crunching against charred wood and broken glass. The smell of smoke still hung thick in the air, mingling with the acrid sting of chemicals sprayed by the firefighters. She couldn't help but take in the damage, a lifetime of memories reduced to ash in mere minutes. Family photos, her father's old military medals, and the small mementos she brought back from her tours overseas, all gone. But grief wasn't the dominant emotion bubbling under the surface. It was fury, tempered only by her intense focus. Whoever had done this didn't just attack her home, they attacked her very existence. The police arrived not long after the flames were extinguished. Their questions were routine, almost mechanical, and Nyla knew they didn't see this for what it was. She could sense it in their tone, the way their eyes flitted over the graffiti but didn't linger. It wasn't the first time she'd seen law enforcement treat something like this as just another case. She answered their questions with clipped precision, keeping her emotions locked away. They did need to see the fire simmering behind a calm exterior. She needed them to leave so she could get to work. One officer, a younger man who looked fresh out of the academy, lingered as the others began wrapping up. "We'll do everything we can to find who did this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of sincerity. "I'm sorry this happened to you." Nyla studied him for a moment. He meant it, she could tell. But he also had no idea who he was talking to. She nodded, her expression softening just slightly. "Thank you, I appreciate it." As the patrol cars pulled away, the crowd of onlookers began to disperse. Neighbors gave her sympathetic nods or murmured words of comfort, but she barely heard them. Her focus was elsewhere, her mind already working through the possibilities. This wasn't random. Someone had gone out of their way to target her. The graffiti alone told her that much. It wasn't just hateful, it was deliberate, calculated. But why? And how did they know where she lived? She thought back to the man she'd noticed earlier, the one whose gaze had lingered too long. She replayed the moment in her mind, analyzing every detail. His stance, the way he seemed to avoid eye contact when she looked in his direction, the faint tension in his shoulders. Was he part of this? Or just a nervous bystander caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? Nyla wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions. Her training wouldn't allow it. But she also wasn't the kind to ignore her instincts, and every fiber of her being told her this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat in the borrowed guest room of a neighbor's house, scrolling through the photos and videos she'd managed to take before the fire consumed everything. She documented her life well, a habit born from years of traveling to places where memories could be fleeting. As she flipped through the images, something struck her. A photo she'd taken at the community center just a few weeks ago. It was a group picture of the kids she mentored, all smiling brightly at the camera. In the background, barely noticeable at first glance, was a figure standing near the door. Zooming in, Nyla felt her pulse quicken. It was the same man she'd seen in the crowd tonight. His face was partially obscured, but the shape of his jawline and the way he held himself were unmistakable. She hadn't noticed him at the time, but now his presence felt like a warning. This wasn't the first time he'd been watching her. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Whoever this man was, he'd been following her long enough to know her routine, her home, and her vulnerabilities. But what he didn't know was that he wasn't dealing with an ordinary person. Nyla had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible, of moving through the shadows unnoticed. If this man thought he could outmaneuver her, he was in for a rude awakening. By morning, Nyla had already formed a plan. She couldn't rely on the authorities to solve this, not fast enough and not thoroughly enough. This was personal. She needed to find out who was behind this, and she needed to do it on her terms. But first, she had to gather intel. Her first stop was the community center. It was still early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon as she parked her car across the street. The building was quiet, its brick walls glowing faintly in the morning light. Nyla knew the staff well. They were like family to her, but she couldn't afford to involve them. Not yet. She needed to figure out how deep this went before she started asking for help. Inside, she went straight to the office and logged into the security system. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for, the footage from the day the group photo was taken. She watched carefully, her eyes trained on the background. There he was again, the same man, lingering near the entrance for far longer than anyone else. He wasn't part of the staff or a parent picking up a child. He had no reason to be there. And yet, there he was, watching. Nyla copied the footage to a flash drive and slipped it into her pocket. She'd need to analyze it further, but for now, she had enough to confirm her suspicions. This man wasn't just some random bystander. He was involved. The question was how, and what his endgame was. As she left the center, Nyla couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she had learned long ago to trust those instincts. Someone was out there, keeping tabs on her. It didn't matter. Let them watch. She wanted them to see that she wasn't running, that she wasn't afraid. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were sorely mistaken. By the time she returned to her temporary shelter, Nyla had pieced together the beginnings of a strategy. She would need to tread carefully, but she wasn't alone in this fight. She had friends, allies from her time in the military, people who owed her favors or would stand by her simply because of who she was. If she called them, they would come. But for now, she had to move quietly. The last thing she wanted was to tip her hand too soon. That night, as the city settled into its usual rhythm, Nyla sat in front of her laptop, reviewing the footage again and again. Every detail mattered. The way the man moved, the subtle glances he cast around the room, the moment he slipped out the door when he thought no one was watching. He was careful, she'd give him that. But no one was perfect. Sooner or later, he'd make a mistake, and when he did, she'd be ready. What Nyla didn't know was that the man wasn't acting alone. As she worked late into the night, her focus razor sharp, a group of figures gathered in a dimly lit room miles away. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces obscured by shadows, their plans unfolding like a chess game. And at the center of it all was a photo of Nyla, taken from a distance, her face circled in red ink. She had become their target, but they had underestimated her. In their arrogance, they believed she was just another victim. What they didn't realize was that they had awakened a force they couldn't control. And as the tension in the room built, as plans were laid and decisions were made, Nyla's resolve only grew stronger. The battle was just beginning, and she was ready to fight. Nyla didn't rest. Every hour she spent reviewing footage and piecing together leads sharpened her focus. The adrenaline coursing through her veins wasn't unfamiliar. It was the same clarity she had relied on during missions, the same sense of urgency that had saved her life countless times. But this wasn't a foreign battlefield. This was her life, her home, her identity under attack. The stakes felt higher because now the enemy wasn't an anonymous force. It was personal, shadowed by the faces of people who thought they could destroy her without consequences. As the days passed, she began to notice patterns. The same man from the footage had been spotted near her house multiple times in the weeks leading up to the fire. Surveillance footage from a local coffee shop captured him sitting at a corner table, pretending to read a newspaper while his eyes followed her as she walked by. He wasn't sloppy, but he wasn't invisible either. Nyla knew she could track him. It was only a matter of time before she got close enough to uncover who he was working with and why they had chosen her. But Nyla wasn't the only one working. Her enemies were already taking the next step. In the same dimly lit room where plans were made, the man she'd seen, Miles as he was called by the others, was briefing the group. He laid out photos, maps, and detailed notes. She's still digging, but she hasn't called anyone yet. She thinks she can handle this alone, he said, his voice calm, calculated. One of the others leaned forward, his voice laced with skepticism. And if she does call for backup, she's military, Army Ranger. If her old unit gets involved, this could spiral out of control. Miles smirked, the kind of expression that came from underestimating someone dangerous. She won't. People like her, they think they're invincible, think they don't need anyone. We've got the upper hand. She's playing defense while we're 2 steps ahead. Their overconfidence was palpable, but it was also their weakness. They didn't understand the depth of Nyla's resourcefulness or the lengths she would go to protect what mattered. What they saw as arrogance was her calculated patience. She wasn't rushing into a fight, she was waiting, watching, letting them feel secure before she struck. Meanwhile, Nyla decided it was time to test the waters. She made a call to an old contact, someone she trusted implicitly. Rick was a retired intelligence officer who owed her a favor, and he picked up on the first ring. "Nyla," he said, his voice warm but immediately serious. "What's going on?" "I need a quiet search run," she replied, skipping any pleasantries. A man, late 30s, tall, wiry build, dark hair. "I got some footage I can send over, but he's been following me for weeks. I think he's part of something bigger." Rick didn't hesitate. "Send me what you've got. I'll dig into it and let you know what I find." It was a small step, but Nyla knew she couldn't rely on Rick alone. She needed to be on the ground, gathering intel in real time. That evening, she slipped into a nondescript hoodie and jeans, blending into the city's nighttime bustle. She retraced her own steps, visiting the places where she'd spotted Miles in the footage. Each stop added another piece to the puzzle, a receipt left behind at the coffee shop, a cashier who remembered him asking too many questions, a security guard at the park who recalled seeing him talking to someone near a black SUV. The SUV was her first solid lead. She spent hours parked near the coffee shop, hoping it would return. Finally, on the 3rd night, she spotted it. The vehicle pulled into the lot, and Miles stepped out, glancing around before heading inside. Nyla followed at a safe distance, her pulse steady, her focus sharp. Inside, she watched as he ordered his coffee and settled into the same corner table, his back to the wall. He pulled out a phone and began scrolling, his demeanor casual. Nyla slid into a seat where she could observe him without being seen. She took in every detail, the way his fingers tapped on the table, the subtle shift in his posture when someone walked past, the way he glanced at the door every few minutes. He was on edge, but he didn't know she was there. Not yet. After about 20 minutes, another man joined him. This one was older, heavier, with a face that radiated authority. They spoke in hushed tones, but Nyla could see the tension in their conversation. She strained to catch fragments of their dialogue, but the hum of the coffee shop made it difficult. Still, the body language told her enough. The older man wasn't happy, and Miles was trying to justify something. When they left, Nyla followed them to the SUV. She stayed far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to keep track of their movements. The vehicle eventually pulled into an industrial area on the outskirts of town, parking near an abandoned warehouse. As the two men disappeared inside, Nyla noted the address, her mind already working through her next move. But this was bigger than she had anticipated. An organized group, a meeting spot, the layers of planning, they weren't just targeting her out of spite. This was calculated. Whatever their goal was, Nyla realized she wasn't dealing with amateurs. These people had resources, connections, had a level of coordination that hinted at something much larger. Back in her temporary quarters, Nyla pieced everything together, mapping out the connections on a board she borrowed from her neighbor. String tied points of interest together. The coffee shop, the park, the warehouse. Miles was the link, but there was more to uncover. Who were the others? What did they want? And how far were they willing to go to achieve it? As the tension mounted, Nyla couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. She was closing in on them, but they were watching her too. Every step she took, every lead she followed, brought her closer to answers, but also closer to danger. And as she stared at the board, the weight of the situation pressed down on her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the message they were trying to send and the lives they were willing to destroy to send it. Outside, the city slept, unaware of the storm brewing in its shadows. Nyla sat in silence, her resolve hardening with each passing moment. She wasn't afraid of the fight ahead, but she knew one thing for sure. The people who thought they could take her down had no idea what kind of storm they had unleashed.